When people talk about car performance, two words come up again and again: torque and horsepower. You'll hear things like, "This car has more horsepower," or "That engine has insane torque." But here's the interesting part. Most drivers use these terms without fully understanding what they actually mean. Are they the same thing? Do they measure the same kind of power? And if you're choosing a car, which one matters more? Because depending on what you want from a vehicle, torque and horsepower can affect the driving experience in very different ways. So in this episode of Techie Tales, we're breaking down torque versus horsepower, what they really mean, how they're connected, and why both numbers matter when it comes to engine performance. Let's start with torque. Torque is essentially a rotational force. In simple terms, it's the twisting force that turns something. A good way to imagine torque is with a wrench. When you use a wrench to loosen a tight bolt, you're applying force at the end of the wrench. The longer the wrench, the easier it becomes to turn the bolt. That twisting force you apply is torque. Inside an engine, something very similar happens. The pistons move up and down inside the cylinders. Through the crankshaft, that up and down motion is converted into a rotating motion. That rotation is what ultimately turns the wheels of the car. Torque is the force responsible for that rotation. The more torque an engine produces, the more force it has to turn the wheels. This is why torque is often associated with strength and pulling power. Vehicles that need to move heavy loads usually rely on engines with high torque. Think about trucks, buses, construction equipment, or large SUVs. These vehicles need strong torque to move their weight and carry heavy cargo. Without enough torque, the engine would struggle to get the vehicle moving. You can feel torque when a car pushes you back into your seat as you accelerate from a stop. That initial surge of force is largely the result of torque. Now let's talk about horsepower. Horsepower measures something slightly different. While torque measures force, horsepower measures how quickly that force can be applied over time. In other words, horsepower is a measurement of work being done over time. The concept of horsepower dates back to the 18th century. An engineer named James Watt was trying to explain the power of steam engines to people who were familiar with horses. So he created a unit called horsepower to compare engine output to the work a horse could perform. 1 horsepower was defined as the ability to lift 550 pounds by 1 foot in 1 second. Over time, this unit became a standard way of describing engine power. In modern cars, horsepower represents how quickly the engine can deliver energy to the wheels. An engine with higher horsepower can usually reach higher speeds more easily. So if torque is the force that turns the wheels, and horsepower is how quickly that force is applied, how do they work together? The answer lies in engine speed. Engines spin at different speeds measured in RPM, or revolutions per minute. Torque is the twisting force produced by the engine, but horsepower depends on both torque and engine speed. If an engine produces torque at a higher RPM, it can generate more horsepower. This is why performance engines often operate at higher RPM levels. They combine strong torque with high engine speed to produce large horsepower numbers. This also explains why different vehicles emphasize different characteristics. Diesel engines, for example, typically produce very high torque at low RPM. That's why diesel-powered trucks feel strong when pulling heavy loads or climbing hills. However, they usually operate at lower RPM ranges, which means their horsepower numbers may appear smaller compared to petrol engines. Petrol engines, on the other hand, often produce less torque but can spin at much higher RPM. That higher engine speed allows them to generate greater horsepower. This is why sports cars often have very high horsepower ratings. You can think of torque and horsepower like two parts of the same system. Torque is the strength of the engine. Horsepower is the speed at which that strength is delivered. A helpful analogy is cycling. Imagine 2 cyclists riding up a hill. One cyclist pushes very hard on the pedals but pedals slowly. The other cyclist pedals much faster but with less force. Both cyclists can reach the top, but they rely on different combinations of force and speed. That's similar to the relationship between torque and horsepower in engines. Now let's talk about how this affects real-world driving. If a vehicle has strong torque, it will usually feel powerful when starting from a stop. Acceleration from low speeds will feel strong and effortless. This is especially useful for towing, hauling cargo, or driving large vehicles. That's why pickup trucks often advertise their torque numbers. High torque makes it easier to pull trailers or carry heavy loads. Horsepower becomes more noticeable at higher speeds. When a car is already moving quickly, horsepower determines how fast it can continue accelerating. High horsepower allows vehicles to reach higher top speeds and maintain strong acceleration on highways. This is why sports cars and performance vehicles emphasize horsepower ratings. Interestingly, torque and horsepower are always connected. In fact, there's a specific point where the two numbers become equal. In many engines, torque and horsepower curves cross at around 5,252 RPM. This happens because of the mathematical relationship between torque, RPM, and horsepower. While drivers don't need to remember the equation, it highlights the fact that torque and horsepower are closely linked. So which one matters more? The truth is, neither torque nor horsepower tells the full story on its own. Both numbers work together to define how an engine performs. For heavy vehicles and towing applications, torque is often more important. For high-speed performance and racing, horsepower becomes more significant. But in everyday driving, what matters most is how the engine delivers its power across different speeds. That's why engineers focus not just on peak numbers, but on the entire power curve of the engine. Modern vehicles also use technologies like turbochargers and hybrid systems to improve both torque and horsepower. Turbochargers can increase the amount of air entering the engine, allowing it to burn more fuel and produce more power. Hybrid systems combine electric motors with traditional engines to deliver instant torque and improved efficiency. As automotive technology evolves, the balance between torque and horsepower continues to change, but the basic principles remain the same. Torque is the force that turns the wheels. Horsepower is how quickly that force can be delivered. Together, they define how an engine feels on the road. The next time you see a car advertisement boasting about horsepower or torque, you'll know that both numbers tell part of the story. High torque means strong pulling power and confident acceleration from low speeds. High horsepower means the ability to maintain strong acceleration and reach higher speeds. Neither one is better in every situation. They simply serve different purposes, and once you understand the difference between torque and horsepower, those engine specifications start to make a lot more sense. Because behind every performance number, there's a piece of engineering working to turn fuel into motion, and that engineering is what makes the machines we drive so fascinating. If you enjoy exploring the technology behind everyday machines, stay tuned to Techie Tales for more deep dives into the engineering that powers our world.